Alrighty, hello everyone and welcome back to Space Games.
Yay!
With the release of Starfield, the discussion of procedural versus handcrafted came up again. I briefly touched on this in my so far only video about Starfield. Now the title of this video and the thumbnail might seem a bit hyperbolic at first, but there is some truth to it. In reality, even games that are using procedural generated content don't do so entirely. It's a mixture of both. The question is, what is the optimal combination? What is the best balance? But first, what is procedural generation? Instead of handcrafting certain content, an algorithm, a mathematical procedure, is used to generate it at runtime. To understand why procedural generated content finds so widespread usage, we have to do a little bit of history. And there is no other genre with a longer history of procedural versus handcrafted than the genre of open world space games. Now let me start with a question. What do you think was the year in which the first 3D open world space game was released which used procedural generation? (1984), 40 years ago. Just to give you some perspective, this is what Netflix looked like 40 years ago, this is what Spotify looked like 40 years ago, and this is what mobile phones looked like 40 years ago. Imagine living in that ancient world and come home and be able to play a 3D open world space adventure, complete with dockable space stations, trading, upgrading your ship, aliens, pirates, police, space combat, the lot. The name of the game was Elite, and although it was adapted to a lot of different platforms over the years, the original console it was made for was called the BBC Micro. Consoles back then were of course heavily limited, especially in terms of memory. That's where procedural generation came in. Instead of storing the data for each planet or system, in this case they were basically the same, the position, the price of goods, the name and so forth, they were procedurally generated during runtime, thus freeing up memory for way cooler stuff. And still making it possible to have a giant galaxy of 256 planets. Even more so by giving the procedure another seed, it could generate another different galaxy with the same number of planets. The publisher limited the number of galaxies to 8, though more would have been possible. Unsurprisingly, Elite was a hit. The impact was massive and it changed the gaming world forever. For over half a decade it completely dominated the space game genre. Until 1990. A company called Origin, which was known for the Ultima series RPG, released a space simulator called Wing Commander. Responsible for this was an upcoming developer called Chris Roberts. Fun fact, traces of Origins can still be found in Chris Roberts games to this date. For instance, the intro sequence with the conductor in Squadron 42 is a homage on the original intro sequence of Origin. The company logo of Origin can still be found on some buildings in Star Citizen. Wing Commander stunned the world like Elite did half a decade earlier, but in a different way. The graphics look better than most of the adventure games at the time. 256 colors, a dynamic story, MIDI sound and music, a more immersive game world. Instead of just flying mission after mission as you would in other simulators of the time, you could actually spend time in between missions with interesting interactions. The save load menu, for instance, was the barracks. You could go to the bar of the carrier you were stationed at and talk to your fellow wingmen and women. They all were distinguishable characters and had their own stories to tell. Sure, these stories were pretty cliché, but the fact that they were there to begin with gave the game a whole lot more depth. You were not just flying missions to gain points or to break the high score. The interactions in between the missions made sure the game world meant something to the player. Also, the entire game felt very cinematic. You had a Star Wars style mission briefing, a Battlestar Galactica style launch sequence. Wing Commander surely knew how to tickle the brain of sci-fi fans. Although the game was later ported to a whole lot of other platforms, its initial release on PC showed the world that the PC was the gaming platform of the future. Other than Elite, Wing Commander was primarily handcrafted, as was its successor, Wing Commander 2, The Vengeance of the Kilrathi, which doesn't sound at all like The Empire Strikes Back. It featured more of the same, actually less. The graphics were improved, but Origin ditched the dynamic story for a linear one, because everyone was just going for the best possible outcome anyway. But it was successful. Chris Roberts was not the developer anymore, but just the producer of the game. But with all the success of the Wing Commander series, Elite was still the reigning king of the open world space games. Here the large use of procedural generated content wasn't challenged. However, the year came in which Chris Roberts' Wing Commander and a brand new Elite title would face off directly. And it was here where we had the biggest battle between procedural and handcrafted content. It was here that all the strengths and shortcomings of both methods were on full display. Let me start with a question again. What do you think was the year in which the first 3D open world space game was released, where you could land on a planet, do your business, start again, fly into space, travel to a space station, dock and do whatever you have to do there, and all absolutely seamless? 1993. 30 years ago. The name of the game was, again, Elite. Well, actually Frontier, Elite 2. But it was the same brand and developed by the same people. Higher available memory allowed for a galaxy featuring 100 billion star systems to explore, the vast majority of which were procedurally generated. It featured about 30 pilotable ships. Again, you could be a pirate, bounty hunter, trader, whatever you want. But this time Elite and its procedurally generated galaxy would face a competitor. In the same year, Chris Roberts and his brother Aaron released Wing Commander Privateer, an open-world space sim in the Wing Commander universe. It featured only about 60 star systems and only 4 pilotable ships. Having played both of these games in the year they were released, I can tell you there was a clear winner. Elite 2 with its 100 billion star system and its 30 pilotable ships didn't stand a chance against Privateer. Because look at it. Ghastly graphics from the 1980s, the cockpit of all different ships looked the same as did the 100 billion planets. Anachronistic menus, the same wireframe dome, the same buildings at every planet. What's the point of having 100 billion planets if they all look the same? Privateer had only about 60 star systems, but they were jam-packed with planets, asteroids fields, mining bases, pirate bases. The different planets and base types also featured their own music. I remember hanging out forever on these pleasure planets with their funky music. There were also unique locations like the busy capital New Constantinople or the Blade Runner-esque New Detroit. The cockpits of your ships were actual cockpits, which you could look around in. They were not just a menu bar. I still love the design of the Galaxy trade ship. It reminded me so much of the Millennium Falcon. Instead of boring menus, you could wander around the bases, go to the bar, talk to the bartender, or the ship salesman who tried to comfort you if you couldn't afford a brand new ship.
That still leaves you short. Go get some more cash and come back when you're ready to deal, okay? And don't feel embarrassed. These things happen.
Speaking of talking, thanks to a speech pack it was actually possible to listen to dialogue. If, for example, a police patrol conducted a contraband search, you could actually see the police officer's face, watch their mouth move and hear their voice.
Maintain speed and course for contraband search. No contraband detected. You may proceed.
This may sound nitpicky, but all these little things add up. Again, Chris and Aaron Roberts did what they are best at, creating an immersive game world. And there's one more really big difference, a main story. In Privateer you get tangled up in an entire cinematic plot around a mysterious alien artifact. You smuggle drugs for pirates, be the henchman of a mob boss. Just by the way, the dialogues between the bodyguard of the mob boss and your alter ego are absolutely hilarious.
Ever seen your lungs? Keep cracking wise, I'll show them to you. Up close like.
Geez, where do you get your dialogue? Thugs or us?
I'm gonna count to 10, then I start shooting. 1, 2, forget this. Start shooting, boys.
You protect the university from religious fanatics, help break the blockade and work for a Navy admiral. All the lore and the story and the different places made the world feel so much bigger than the world of Elite, despite only having 60 star systems instead of a quadrillion. And one of the main reasons it achieved all that was because it was mainly handcrafted. The developers set their asses down and were actually putting in the work. Designing planets and bases, designing cockpits, writing dialogue, voice actors actually spoke the dialogue, musicians composed the different tunes. All that was more work than to rely on just sheer size. But it paid off. Elite tried to counter 2 years later with First Encounters Elite 3, but it was just a retextured Elite 2. So procedural generation was that then? No. In 1994, a small software company called Bethesda released a huge open-world RPG called The Elder Scrolls Arena. It relied heavily on a procedurally generated game world, as did its successor The Elder Scrolls Daggerfall, also known as Buggerfall. Both of these games have a bigger game world than the Elder Scrolls games that followed them. Morrowind, Oblivion and Skyrim would again rely more on handcrafted content. And which are the Elder Scrolls games that we remember the most? For a while it looked as if the war procedural versus handcrafted was decided, until it broke out again and culminated in the entire discussion around Starfield. But one step at a time. In December 2013, a game called No Man's Sky was announced. A game in which you could seamlessly start and land on planets, but the planets actually contained terrain you could explore on foot and even underwater. Even more so, planets could house alien life forms. All that is, you guessed it, procedurally generated. Just like Elite in 1984, a small game developer used procedural generation to create a lot of content. And just as Elite, it suffered from the same issues. The gameplay loops were small, and after a couple of planets you basically seen it all. The reception of the game wasn't very positive at first. Only thanks to a series of updates could the game be saved. Most of these updates focused on better home-based customization, expansion of multiplayer, a lot of addition to the story and lore, and VR capabilities. So most of this additional content was handcrafted, or at least added more variety in the procedural generated content. The fact they still put out these big updates 7 years after the game release shows how much handwork was necessary to salvage the game. However, it showed once more how procedural generation can be used as a good base for a game. But if you rely too heavily on it, if it is your only selling point, it fails. Elite Dangerous was released in December 2014, and 1 year later the update Horizons. Elite did what Elite always did. Create a giant universe full of planets to explore. But only a small part of the galaxy was filled with space stations and thus had the opportunity to take on missions, trade, be a pirate or a bounty hunter. I played the game myself and can say that I left the so-called bubble, which is where all these space stations are, only 3 or 4 times. And every time I did, I could not wait to get back to it. Again, relying mostly on procedurally generated content, Elite Dangerous faced the same criticism. Vast as an ocean, deep as a puddle. However, a good flight model, a lot of pilotable ships and engaging space combat compensated for the lack of content. Around the same time, Chris Roberts started working on a new open-world space game himself, called Star Citizen. Just as in No Man's Sky, he wanted to have a game world you could explore seamlessly. From walking to your ship, taking off, landing, getting out of your ship, walking to wherever you need to go. And just like the other 2 games, he needs procedural generation to accomplish that, because an entire planet does not fit into the memory. But there is a fundamental difference to No Man's Sky and Elite Dangerous. There is also a massive amount of handcrafted content. Missions where you have to find out what happened to a derelict ship, events where you have to fight off pirates, handcrafted locations, the industrial dirty city Lawville, the celebrity escape world of Orison, the cyberpunky city of Area 18, the skiing paradise Microtech, or the dark underground prison Klesher. There is more variety in one system in Star Citizen than in all of Elite Dangerous. Also, Star Citizen features over 130 pilotable ships, all with their bespoke interior, from the light fighter to the heavy gunboat, from the practical freighter to the luxury liner. Every ship is different. Again, Chris Roberts does what Chris Roberts does best, creating an immersive game world. The reception of this was so positive that even Frontier waved the white flag and gave us on-foot content and station interiors. The point here is that Star Citizen uses procedurally generated content, but it's only canvas. Most of the actual content is handcrafted. In my opinion, CIG has found the perfect balance. Use procedural generated content when we are not looking so closely, and when we do, use handcrafted. By the way, this doesn't mean that the game is perfect. I have my own bone to pick with Star Citizen. But this is not what this is about. It's about the balance of handcrafted and procedural generated content. Now let's circle back to the beginning of this video. Bethesda relied heavily on procedural generated content in the first 2 Elder Scrolls games, but quickly got off it. And rightly so. Morrowind, Oblivion and Skyrim are way better. But for Starfield, they decided to increase the usage of procedural generated content again and fell flat on their face. This wasn't unpredictable, but what gave them the idea that this time it would work? As I hinted in my previous video about Starfield, I guess the success of games like No Man's Sky and Star Citizen. The funny thing is, if we compare Star Citizen to Starfield, they look very similar. Both have walkable procedural generated planets with some outputs on it. In both games, some of the planets have big walkable cities. In both games you can use trams and trains to get around in these cities. In both games you have a variety of spaceships. In both games you can use these to fly through space, and in both games you have space combat and ground combat. But there are some fundamental differences. One of these games is a single-player RPG, the other one is a multiplayer sandbox. And what's more, in one game everything is seamless, in the other every transition needs a load screen. The problem here is that Starfield uses methods best suited for MMO space games and try to apply them to a single-player RPG. In my opinion, that doesn't really work. So where does this leave us? Well, just like any other tool, procedural generation can be very helpful. But if a game developer relies too heavily on it, if it becomes an end in itself, the result is very shallow. Again, it's about the balance, and after all those decades and after all those games relying so much on handcrafted content, it is Chris Roberts of all people who found the perfect balance. But maybe that's exactly why. My guess is he's not very fond of procedural generated content and thus only wants to apply it if it's absolutely inevitable. And I think that is the perfect balance. So that's it for today. Take care and tschüss.